In the courtroom, where the fate of a police officer hung in the balance, no one expected the most powerful testimony to come from a 6-year-old boy. What he said about his father left everyone, jury, prosecutors, and even the judge, speechless. But could the words of a child change the outcome of a trial and save a man's career? This is a story about truth, innocence, and the unexpected heroism of a child. Stay tuned to find out how one little boy turned the tide of a courtroom battle in the most surprising way imaginable. The courtroom was packed to the brim that day, with spectators filling every available seat and reporters lined up in the back corner. It wasn't just any case. It was the kind of case that grabbed the public's attention, sparked heated debates, and, most importantly, questioned the integrity of those entrusted with the law. This trial had become the talk of the town. The accused, Officer Mark Lawson, a respected member of the local police force, known for his tough but fair approach to his work. The charge, excessive use of force during an arrest. The incident in question had occurred 2 months prior, during a routine traffic stop that spiraled into a violent altercation. Officer Lawson, while trying to detain a suspect who was attempting to flee, had been caught on camera striking the suspect with his baton. The footage, though shaky and unclear in certain parts, seemed to show the officer hitting the man multiple times, far more than was necessary to subdue him. It was the kind of footage that could change the public's perception of an officer forever. It left the people divided. Some argued the officer was just doing his job, while others believed he had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The case had polarized the community, with activists rallying against police brutality and others defending the police as heroes who risked their lives daily to protect the public. The trial had dragged on for weeks, with both sides presenting witnesses, expert testimonies, and mountains of evidence. Yet, no one had expected the next twist to come from the unlikeliest source, a 6-year-old boy. The atmosphere in the courtroom on that final day was tense, almost electric. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Sandra Keating, paced back and forth, going over her notes and occasionally glancing at the defense table, where Officer Lawson sat with his legal team. He appeared calm on the outside, but there was a subtle tension in his posture, as though the weight of the trial was slowly crushing him. His family, sitting in the front row, held their breath. His wife, Jennifer, sat with her hands tightly clasped, her eyes fixed on her husband. Their 2 children, a teenage girl and a younger boy, fidgeted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable in the oppressive silence of the courtroom. The gallery, which included local citizens, reporters, and even a few social media influencers, leaned forward, anticipating the next piece of evidence. The stakes had never been higher. The entire community was watching. Then came the moment that would change everything. The judge, a seasoned jurist named Judge Margaret Foley, raised her gavel and called for order. The room grew still, the air thick with anticipation. The prosecutor, having just presented the final video evidence showing Officer Lawson using excessive force, sat back down. The video had shocked everyone in the room. It showed the officer, baton raised, striking the suspect repeatedly. No words could undo the damage that footage had done. "We will now proceed with the defense's witnesses," Judge Foley announced, her voice carrying authority. The defense lawyer, a calm and methodical man named Robert Matthews, stood up and motioned to the back of the room. "Your Honor," the defense calls young Thomas Lawson to the stand. The murmurs that rippled through the courtroom were immediate. The child, Thomas, was the officer's son. His testimony was unexpected. Most of the witnesses called by the defense had been adults, people who could speak directly to the officer's character, his actions on the day of the incident, and the circumstances surrounding it. But Thomas, a 6-year-old boy, the defense team hadn't disclosed that they were bringing him to testify, so this announcement took everyone by surprise. The gallery fell silent, and all eyes turned to the back of the courtroom, where a small boy stood, hand in his mother's. His little shoes squeaked softly on the floor as he walked toward the witness stand. His tiny suit looked out of place in such a serious setting, and he looked up at the judge with wide, innocent eyes. Officer Lawson, who had been sitting with his back straight and his face somber, now looked at his son with a mixture of pride and nervousness. He had known that Thomas had witnessed the events surrounding the incident, but he hadn't anticipated that his son would be called to testify. It was a moment of vulnerability, and his heart pounded in his chest. Thomas clutched his mother's hand tightly as he climbed up onto the witness stand, his little legs barely reaching the footrest. The room, once filled with whispers and the sound of clicking cameras, had gone completely still. Everyone was waiting for this unexpected witness to speak. The defense attorney approached him gently, crouching down to the boy's level. "Thomas," he began softly, "can you tell us what happened that day when the police officer came to your house?" The boy's eyes were wide, scanning the room. His gaze flickered nervously across the faces in the gallery, as though he didn't quite understand why so many people were staring at him. Finally, he looked at the defense attorney, then down at his lap, as if gathering his thoughts. I saw a man," Thomas began hesitantly. His small voice was barely audible at first, but the room grew so quiet that even the softest whisper could be heard. "A bad man. He was trying to hurt my mommy." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, wondering if this was going to be another childish fantasy, an attempt at garnering sympathy. But Thomas wasn't finished. Then the police officer came. He told the bad men to go away. There was a pause, as if the courtroom was waiting for more. The defense attorney smiled slightly, encouraging the boy to continue. "What did the police officer do next, Thomas?" The boy's eyes widened even further. He pointed with his small finger directly at Officer Lawson, who sat at the defense table. "He stopped the bad man. He helped my mommy." The words rang out like a bell in the otherwise silent room. The audience was stunned. What was happening? Could this innocent little boy really be a witness to something that was so far removed from the violent footage that had dominated the case? At that moment, it was clear that something extraordinary was about to unfold. As Thomas sat on the witness stand, his small figure barely visible behind the giant podium, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the little boy, waiting for what he would say next. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed in an instant. The tension from the previous testimony, the skepticism about the officer's actions, and the weight of the video evidence had all been momentarily forgotten. Now, all anyone could think about was this tiny child, dressed in an oversized suit, with his innocent face turned toward them. The defense attorney, Robert Matthews, had carefully prepared for this moment. He knew that calling Thomas to the stand could be risky, but it was a calculated move. Thomas had been in the room that day, had seen the events unfold through the eyes of a child. He was too young to understand the complexities of police procedure or courtroom legalities, but he knew one thing. He knew the officer had been there to help. That simple truth, if conveyed correctly, could tip the scale in Officer Lawson's favor. Matthews, a seasoned attorney, wasn't going to rush this. He knelt down beside the stand to meet Thomas at eye level, his voice soft and calm. "Thomas," he began gently, "can you tell us what happened that day when the police officer came to your house?" The boy's small voice trembled, though his words were clear. "I saw a bad man," Thomas said, looking down at his hands. His words, simple as they were, held a raw honesty that no one could ignore. "He wanted to hurt my mommy." The room was still. Every adult in the room, from the judge to the reporters in the back, leaned in slightly, as if trying to catch every word. The prosecutor, Sandra Keating, furrowed her brow, exchanging a brief, skeptical glance with her co-counsel. This was not the testimony she had been expecting. A 6-year-old boy speaking of bad men and hurting in such a straightforward manner was not something that could easily be explained away. Robert Matthews noticed the prosecutor's discomfort and seized the opportunity. "What happened next, Thomas?" he asked, keeping his tone soft and encouraging, but firm enough to guide the boy through his testimony. Thomas shifted in his seat. He clearly wasn't used to being the center of attention. His eyes wandered over the crowd, landing momentarily on his mother, who sat in the front row, her face tight with worry. She gave him a reassuring smile, which seemed to give him a bit of courage. Thomas took a deep breath and continued. "The police officer came. He told the bad man to go away. Then he helped my mommy." The words were simple, innocent, but they hit with the force of a freight train. The entire courtroom fell into silence again. Keating, the prosecutor, now stood up, unable to remain quiet any longer. She shot a glance at the judge, who nodded slightly, giving her permission to cross-examine the young boy. Keating's voice rang out as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I believe we should consider the reliability of this testimony. This child, as sweet as he may be, is hardly capable of understanding the complexity of what occurred on that day. Children at this age are prone to imaginative fantasies, and I think it's clear that this boy's account may have been influenced by his parents or others around him." There was a ripple through the courtroom as people began murmuring. Was the boy's testimony nothing more than a product of a child's imagination? Was he simply repeating what he had been told by his parents or the defense team? The judge, however, seemed unfazed by Keating's objection. "I understand your concern, Ms. Keating. However, we cannot dismiss a child's testimony simply because of his age. His words, after all, are his own. I'll allow you to continue with your questions, but let's ensure they remain respectful and appropriate for the child's age." Keating's face tightened as she turned back to Thomas. She wasn't done with him yet. "Thomas," she began, her voice now sharper, "do you really understand what you're talking about? Can you explain to the court exactly what you mean when you say the officer helped your mommy? How did he help?" Thomas blinked at her, clearly confused by the question. His tiny hands gripped the sides of the witness stand as he stared at the prosecutor. "He made the bad man go away," Thomas said, his voice small but steady. "He made my mommy feel safe." Keating's lips pressed into a thin line as she tried once again to press him for more details. "Did you actually see the police officer do anything to the man? Do you know what kind of help the officer provided?" Thomas's face, innocent as ever, was unfazed by her questioning. "I don't know what he did to the bad man. I was too scared," he said, his eyes wide. "But my mommy wasn't scared anymore. And that's all I know. He helped us." For a second, there was a collective pause in the courtroom. Thomas's words seemed so simple, yet so profoundly impactful. There was no detailed description of physical force or legal jargon, just the truth through the eyes of a child. The officer helped them, and that was all that mattered to Thomas. Matthews, seeing that the prosecutor had no more questions, stood up again. He could feel the room's mood shift. The tension from earlier had dissipated, replaced with something different, something softer, more human. He smiled gently at Thomas before addressing the court. "Thank you, Thomas. You've been very brave. Your testimony is important, and it helps us all understand what really happened." As Matthews returned to his seat, a murmur of disbelief and admiration swept through the gallery. People were beginning to realize that what they had just heard wasn't the result of rehearsed words or legal manipulation. It was the raw, unfiltered account of a child who had seen his mother frightened and had witnessed a police officer who, in the purest sense, had done what he was supposed to do: protect and serve. But the most important thing of all was that Thomas's account had not been about the violence, the accusations, or the controversy surrounding the case. He hadn't mentioned the baton, the video footage, or any of the specifics that had dominated the trial. He had spoken about the feeling of safety, of protection. His simple words, "He helped my mommy," rang with an honesty that transcended the courtroom. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew that something profound had just happened. A 6-year-old boy had, in the most innocent way possible, revealed the heart of the case. The police officer had been there to help, not hurt. For the first time in weeks, the scales of justice seemed to shift, if only slightly. The weight of Thomas's testimony was undeniable. The silence that followed Thomas's testimony seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog, pressing down on the room and making it difficult for anyone to breathe. His simple words, "He helped my mommy," had pierced through the cold, hard legal arguments and brought an unexpected warmth to the proceedings. It wasn't just the innocence of the boy speaking. It was the purity of truth that, in its simplest form, became undeniable. The boy had spoken from the heart, and his words had revealed something that the courtroom hadn't anticipated, a side of the story that no piece of evidence or video footage could fully convey. The room was still, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if time itself had frozen. The defense attorney, Robert Matthews, had taken a step back and allowed the boy's words to settle in. There was nothing more to be said. The case had been about facts, about force, about law, but now it had shifted. It was about something deeper, something more human. And it was about a little boy's honesty and innocence. The judge, her stern expression softening, glanced at the gallery. She could sense the shift in the air as well, the change in atmosphere that Thomas's testimony had brought. She tapped her gavel gently, signaling for order. But there was no need for the gavel to bring silence. The entire room was already hanging on every word. Keating, the prosecutor, stood rigidly at her desk, her mind racing. She had been prepared for everything. The video footage, the expert witnesses, the emotional testimony of the victim's family. She had not, however, anticipated a child so innocent, so truthful, that even the coldest hearts in the room would be moved. She blinked, struggling to hold back a mix of frustration and disbelief. How could something so simple, so pure, suddenly shift the momentum of the case? She had expected to discredit the officer, to prove that the footage showed clear signs of excessive force. But now, with the boy's testimony, it was clear the officer hadn't just used force. He had done something far more profound. I need a moment, Your Honor, Keating finally said, her voice strained. She wasn't asking for a recess, but for time to regroup and refocus. She knew her strategy was crumbling. There was no way to undo the emotional impact that Thomas had had on the jury and the gallery. His words, though simple, were the thread that could unravel the prosecutor's entire case. The judge nodded with understanding, but didn't immediately grant a break. "We will proceed with the defense's closing arguments," Judge Foley announced, her voice steady and firm. "But, Ms. Keating, I do expect you to present your case with clarity moving forward." The prosecutor, her back straight and her jaw clenched, sat down without a word. The defense team, meanwhile, exchanged glances, clearly relieved. Matthews, feeling the tide shift in their favor, rose to his feet with a quiet confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Matthews began, his voice calm and composed, "what you've just heard from Thomas Lawson is more than just the words of a child. It is the truth, untainted by the complexities of this case. When we strip away the footage, the legal jargon, and the media frenzy, what remains is this simple truth. Officer Mark Lawson was there to help." Matthews paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. He could see the jury members, their faces softening, their eyes looking back at him with a mixture of doubt and curiosity. This was the moment where everything could change. "Thomas told you what happened," Matthews continued, "from the perspective of someone who wasn't looking at the situation through the lens of law or policy. He didn't see the officer's baton, the force, or the struggle. He saw someone who protected his mother, someone who made her feel safe when she was scared. We can debate the legality of the officer's actions, but we cannot debate the fact that his actions made a difference to this child and his family." The prosecutor's eyes flicked toward the defense table, frustration evident in her gaze. She knew Matthews was winning over the jury with the boy's testimony, but what could she do? She had no choice but to follow the script and push back with what she had left. The defense wants you to believe that a child's simple words should outweigh everything else. But let's not forget the facts. Let's not forget the video. Let's not forget the expert testimony. Keating's voice cut through, sharp as a knife. This isn't about a child's perception of safety. It's about what is legally right and just. Officer Lawson's use of force cannot be excused by one child's memory. Matthews was quick to respond, unfazed by the prosecutor's attempt to regain control. "Ms. Keating, I respect the evidence you've presented, but you're missing the point. The law is meant to protect people, yes, but it's also meant to seek justice. And justice doesn't always come in the form of a video. Justice doesn't always come in the form of a rule book. Sometimes, justice comes in the form of a child's voice, telling us exactly what happened in a way that no adult can." He looked toward Thomas, who was sitting quietly beside his mother in the front row, his little legs swinging beneath him. What Thomas told you today wasn't a rehearsed answer. It wasn't something he'd learned from anyone else. It was his truth. The jury members were visibly moved. some even wiping away the faintest of tears. Matthews had struck a chord. He wasn't just defending the officer. He was defending the idea that people, especially children, could be honest in the face of overwhelming odds, that truth could come from the most unlikely of places. And that was exactly what Thomas's words had done. They had cut through the noise, through the legal tactics and courtroom drama, and revealed a side of Officer Lawson that no one had considered, a side of the officer as a protector, not an aggressor. This was not the image of the officer portrayed by the prosecutor, who had framed him as a figure of excessive force. This was the officer as a hero, a man doing what he believed was right. The prosecutor had nothing left to counter that. The jury had seen the video. They had heard the legal arguments. But now they had heard something even more powerful, a child's untainted truth, delivered with the courage only a 6-year-old could muster. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. The jury filed out of the room for deliberation, their expressions somber but thoughtful. No one could say for sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear. The case had been forever changed by a little boy's honesty. When the gavel finally came down, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, the room felt heavier with expectation than ever before. What had begun as a trial focused on force and violence had become, in the end, a trial about truth, perception, and justice. And Thomas Lawson, in his simple words, had altered the entire course of the case. As the courtroom emptied, the energy was palpable but mixed. The tension that had hung in the air throughout the trial had now settled into something deeper, a sense of anticipation, uncertainty, and even fear. The jury, now sequestered in their deliberation room, had the weight of the decision on their shoulders. Their job was to decide the fate of Officer Mark Lawson, a man accused of using excessive force during a routine arrest. But it was no longer a simple case of looking at the video footage or listening to expert testimonies. Now, they had to grapple with something much more powerful, the words of a child. It was late in the afternoon when the jury first gathered in the deliberation room. 12 individuals, men and women from all walks of life, sat around a large table, each of them consumed by their own thoughts, each of them reflecting on the evidence presented. The trial had lasted weeks, but now it came down to a single moment. The testimony of young Thomas Lawson, the 6-year-old boy who had sat on the witness stand and spoken from the heart. He helped my mommy. Those words echoed in every juror's mind, almost louder than the video footage, the expert testimonies, or even the heated arguments of the lawyers. The foreman, a middle-aged man named Richard Phillips, cleared his throat as he stood up and faced the group. "Okay, folks," he said, his voice serious but calm. "We've got a big decision ahead of us. Let's start by reviewing the evidence." But as soon as he began speaking, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. The jurors' eyes flickered to one another, some avoiding eye contact, others lost in thought. One of the women, Janet, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had been one of the first to speak up after Thomas's testimony, visibly shaken by the child's words. I can't get over what he said," she admitted, her voice quiet but firm. "That boy, he didn't even sound like he was trying to convince us of anything. He was just telling the truth, the kind of truth that you can't fake." Her words struck a chord with the others. The room grew quieter, each juror mentally replaying the boy's testimony in their minds. The boy hadn't tried to explain the legalities of the situation or elaborate on the severity of the force used. He simply shared his experience, and it was powerful. In that moment, Janet's sentiment was felt by everyone in the room. How could they ignore such a raw, honest statement from a child? "I don't know," said another juror, Mark, a young man in his 30s. "I'm torn. I saw the video. I saw the officer strike that man. He didn't look like he was trying to de-escalate the situation. It looked like unnecessary force." There was a collective nod of agreement around the table. Most of the jurors had seen the footage, and it wasn't easy to forget. The video had shown Officer Lawson using his baton repeatedly to subdue the suspect, who appeared to be trying to flee. The defense argued that Lawson had acted out of necessity to protect himself and others, but that video had left a mark. It wasn't just the strikes. It was the apparent disregard for the situation once the suspect was on the ground. "But we can't ignore Thomas," Janet said, her voice insistent. "The officer made him feel safe. That matters. He wasn't there to hurt anyone. He was there to protect." As Janet spoke, the others at the table looked around at each other. They were struggling with the dichotomy. On the one hand, there was the video evidence, hard, undeniable, and showing a level of force that seemed excessive. On the other hand, there was the testimony of a child, pure, unfiltered, and delivered with such sincerity that it forced them to confront something beyond the law, something more human. Could a child's view of the situation carry more weight than the cold, hard facts presented in court? After a long silence, Richard spoke again. "I think we all know what this boils down to. The question is, did Officer Lawson go too far? Was he right to use that level of force to detain the suspect, or was it unnecessary? And what about the boy's testimony? Can we let his words carry more weight than the video?" There was another pause as each juror weighed the question in their minds. In the back of the room, a younger juror named Claire finally spoke up. I don't know how I can ignore the fact that Thomas said he felt safe afterward. That's something that the video doesn't show. It's not just about what we see with our eyes. It's about how the people involved felt." Her words sparked another round of murmurs. The jurors were beginning to understand. This wasn't just a case of legal procedure. It was a case about protection, safety, and what it meant to be a hero, even in a moment that was difficult to define. Officer Lawson had acted to protect, but did that justify his actions? And what did it mean for the people he was supposed to protect, like Thomas? "I'm with you on this, Claire," said another juror, David, a man in his 40s. "The boy's testimony changed everything. I've been thinking about it since he spoke. He didn't see an officer using excessive force. He saw someone who made his mom feel safe. That says a lot." The room was now deep in discussion. They weren't just debating the law or the evidence. They were debating the essence of justice itself. Should the law focus solely on rules and procedures? Or was there room for empathy, for understanding, for the simple truth that sometimes protecting others came down to more than just legalities? But even as the jurors began to sway toward a consensus, there was still an undercurrent of doubt. Some still questioned whether the officer had gone too far. Could they let go of the video, which clearly showed multiple strikes? Was it possible that Officer Lawson's actions had been justified in the heat of the moment, even if they didn't fit the textbook definition of appropriate force? Hours passed. The jurors debated, argued, and shared their perspectives. Each person was on a personal journey, wrestling with their own conscience as they sifted through the complexities of the case. The weight of the decision, what it meant for Officer Lawson, for the boy, and for the community, was not lost on any of them. By the time the sun began to set, the deliberation room felt like a place of quiet exhaustion. It was as though every one of them had been tested, not just as jurors, but as human beings. Finally, Richard spoke up, his voice steady. "I think we're getting close. But I'll say this, it's not just about the officer's actions. It's about what we believe is right. And sometimes, the right thing isn't always clear." In that final moment, as the jury began to prepare for their verdict, each person in the room carried the weight of the truth they had heard from a 6-year-old child. And that truth, the simple, untainted words of a boy who felt safe, had changed everything. It had been hours since the jury had begun their deliberations, and the courtroom was now a hushed, anxious place. Everyone, the defense, the prosecution, and the gallery, waited with bated breath. The jury had been deliberating for nearly an entire day, their minds wrestling with the complexity of the case and the unexpected emotional weight of a 6-year-old boy's testimony. There were no easy answers here. Officer Mark Lawson's future hung in the balance, and as the clock ticked on, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. Inside the jury room, the final discussions had taken a different tone. What had begun as a debate over the specifics of the case, the video footage, the use of force, had now evolved into something more profound. The testimony of little Thomas Lawson, as simple and pure as it had been, had shifted the conversation in a way that no one had anticipated. The question was no longer just about the law, but about the heart of justice itself. Could they, as jurors, set aside their doubts and truly listen to what the child had said? Could they allow his truth to outweigh the video, the expert testimony, and the mountain of evidence that pointed to one thing, that Officer Lawson had used excessive force? Finally, after hours of internal conflict, the jury had come to a consensus. They were ready to present their verdict. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and the 12 jurors entered, each of them appearing more somber than they had when they first filed in. The foreman, Richard Phillips, stood at the front, a folder in his hands, his face unreadable. As he approached the bench, the gallery fell into a silence, so deep it was almost suffocating. The judge, her expression carefully neutral, gestured for him to speak. "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice steady, though there was an underlying tension, "we, the jury, have reached a verdict." The judge nodded, signaling for him to continue. The entire room was on edge. The tension was so thick, it felt as though the walls themselves might collapse under the weight of it. All eyes were now fixed on Richard as he held up the piece of paper with the jury's decision. On the charge of excessive use of force, Richard read aloud, his voice echoing in the otherwise silent courtroom. "We find the defendant, Officer Mark Lawson, not guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if time had frozen. There was a stunned silence before a ripple of gasps broke out. The defense team visibly relaxed, their shoulders slumping in relief. The prosecution, however, stood rigid, their faces a mixture of disbelief and frustration. It was clear that they hadn't expected this outcome, and yet the verdict had been delivered. In the gallery, Thomas's mother, Christine Lawson, was the first to react. She covered her mouth with her hands, as if to hold back the tears that had begun to well up in her eyes. It wasn't just a verdict for her husband. This was a verdict for her son. Her little boy had spoken the truth, and now that truth had been validated by the jury. The officer had not only protected her, but he had also been proven innocent of the charges. The weight that had been pressing down on her for weeks, anxiety, fear, and doubt, began to lift, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief. Thomas, sitting beside her, didn't fully understand the gravity of what had just happened. He was young, still innocent, but the look on his face was one of quiet pride. He had helped in a way no one else could. His words had made a difference. His voice had been heard. Officer Lawson stood up from his seat at the defense table, his eyes flickering between the judge, the prosecutor, and the jury. His face, usually stoic and composed, betrayed a faint crack in his armor. He had endured weeks of scrutiny, public opinion, and personal doubt. But now, as he looked around the courtroom and saw the relief in his wife's eyes, he felt a sense of vindication that was difficult to put into words. The prosecutor, Sandra Keating, was the first to speak, though her words were laced with tension. "Your Honor," she began, her voice betraying none of the anger she was undoubtedly feeling. "The jury's decision is noted, but we reserve the right to file an appeal. This is not the end of this case." The judge nodded, acknowledging the prosecutor's statement, but it was clear that the court had made its decision. Officer Lawson was free to go, and for him, that was the most important thing. The battle had been long, and the emotional toll had been high, but the relief that flooded his chest now was worth every moment of pain. As the gallery slowly began to empty, Officer Lawson approached Thomas, who was still seated next to his mother. He knelt down beside his son, his heart swelling with pride. "You did good, kid," Officer Lawson said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Thomas looked up at him, his small face beaming. "I told them you helped, Daddy. I knew you would." And in that moment, Mark Lawson realized something deeper than just his acquittal. His son had seen him for who he truly was, a protector, a hero. It wasn't about the case, the video, or the legal arguments. It was about being there for the people you love and doing what's right, even when the world questions you. In a way, it was his son who had taught him that lesson. Through the child's innocent eyes, Officer Lawson had seen the kind of heroism that wasn't born of force, but of love and responsibility. The courtroom was empty now, save for the Lawsons and a few remaining reporters. Outside, the world moved on, but for this family, the trial was over. They had weathered the storm and come out the other side stronger than before. Officer Lawson was not only cleared of all charges, but the profound impact of his son's testimony had shaped the course of his life in ways he could never have anticipated. As they walked out of the courthouse together, hand in hand, the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow on their faces. Thomas, small but mighty, walked between his parents, his face filled with a sense of quiet pride. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, had helped his father find his own. In the end, it wasn't just a verdict that had changed the course of the trial. It was the power of one simple, truthful voice spoken by a child, one that had reverberated through the courtroom and shifted the trajectory of the case. And for Officer Lawson, that voice had made all the difference.